Hello, and welcome to the final webinar of this year's Smart Money Week in Agriculture, brought to you by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Agricultural Profitability and Nebraska Extension, with support from the North Central Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Center. I'm Shannon Sand, agricultural economist with Nebraska Extension. Through daily webinars this week, Ag Smart Money Week has aimed to equip farmers and ranchers with the latest tools, information, and strategies to improve their financial management and risk management to build success in their business. You can find the recordings and slides from the webinars this week posted on the Center for Ag Profitability's website, cap.unl.edu/smartmoney. Today, we'll learn about understanding and managing debt in farm and ranch operations. We're joined by Extension agricultural economist Jessica Groskopf, who will cover essential concepts and strategies to help you make informed decisions about both personal and business debt. We invite any questions during the presentation to be typed into the chat box or the Q&A. Jessica, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Shannon. So we've had a really kind of fun week together. If you have been here all week, on Monday, we talked about including family living into farm and ranch budgets. On Wednesday, we talked about investing with Shannon. And today we're going to be talking about navigating debt. And so this is really looking at that kind of full picture, particularly of family living as we look at farm and ranch families. So as we go through today, again, I really encourage you to add your questions to the chat or the Q&A. We'll try to address those as we go along. And what you'll find is I have a little bit of a different opinion from maybe some popular personal finance experts that you see or hear regularly. And so I'll try to point out some of those differences and why I think there should be a different strategy for farm and ranch families. So the first thing that I would like to point out and really want to emphasize is that you should not be ashamed of the choices that you have made. And the biggest thing here is that not all debt is bad. I think there's a lot of personal finance experts out there who are really on this train that debt is this evil thing, and really debt is a tool. And for farmers and ranchers, especially those of us who are coming into farming and ranching, debt is a tool that we need to use to be able to farm or to ranch. Often we make the best choices that we can with the knowledge, skills, and options that we have. And also, it's unproductive to dwell on the past choices that we cannot undo. So as we move through today, no matter where you're at, I want you to know that debt is a tool. And we're going to talk about how we utilize that tool effectively. So what is debt? Debt is an obligation to repay money that you have borrowed. Sometimes you'll hear it called, again, an obligation or a liability. And there are lots of examples of debt that we have. So credit cards, operating notes, or lines of credit, accounts payable, mortgages, equipment loans, etc. So we're going to be talking about all of these kinds of debt that occur within farm and ranches and within families. So why do we use debt? And really, there's two main reasons why we use debt. And the first is that we don't have enough cash to purchase an item outright. And this is true within farms and ranches, right? If we don't have consistent cash flow, there's periods where we don't have enough cash to purchase inputs, or we don't have enough cash because the asset that we're trying to purchase or the item that we're trying to purchase is so expensive. And so we're going to use debt to be able to purchase that item. The other situation or scenario, which was probably more common a few years back, is that the cost of that loan is so low when we compare it to other places we could put our money that we decide to take the loan rather than investing somewhere else. So for example, when interest rates were at, let's say 3% or lower, right, that money was so cheap that we decided we're going to borrow funds from the bank, use other people's money, and then leaving our money free for other investments, which at the time could have been earning 8+%. Now, we're not in that scenario right now. Interest rates on loans are higher. However, there are quite a few people who still have those low interest rate loans that they're working with. So again, that low interest rate loan was a good move at that time, and they're lucky that they were able to lock in at that lower interest rate. So just a couple of terms that I'm going to be using today, and I want us to be on the same page about. And if you're not familiar with loans, I do have a QR code on the screen there. We have an article we released earlier this year that I would encourage you to go and read more about loans if you're not familiar with them. You can scan that. But today we're really going to be focusing on three components of loans. So that's the principal, which is the amount of money that you borrow to purchase an item, the term, which is the amount of time it takes to repay. And in agriculture, we really kind of divide those into three categories, which would be short-term loans, which are less than a year, intermediate loans, which have a life of 1 to 10 years, and long-term loans, which have a life greater than 10 years. The last thing that we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about that interest rate, which is the fee that the bank or the person lending us money charges us to borrow that money. There might be additional fees that also apply, but really we're looking at that interest rate. And oftentimes you'll see that called the annual percentage rate, or APR. So again, the APR and the interest rate are somewhat synonymous here. Okay, so let's hop into kind of these different types of loans. And the first one that most of us will be running into are short-term loans. And we are pretty familiar with credit cards, but in agriculture, often farms and ranches will have operating notes or lines of credit. Okay, so these are those short-term loans. Again, they have a life of less than a year, where we're borrowing and potentially repaying that loan throughout the year. What's interesting specifically in agriculture is that often these short-term loans are not just offered by traditional banks, they are also offered by input suppliers like seed and chemical companies. And so they might provide you an incentive to purchase from them, and maybe they'll offer, 6 months of free financing. So, no payments for 6 months. And this can make it difficult for farmers and ranchers, because then we have kind of these short-term loans in various places, and we need to make sure that we're tracking all of that information. These short-term loans are primarily used for input purchases during periods of inconsistent cash flow. So again, as we think about agriculture, right, there's those times where we don't have income coming in, but we need to be purchasing inputs so that we can produce those products. So that's what we're going to be using these short-term loans for. You really need to watch these short-term loans. We need to know the difference in the interest rate that each loan is charging. And I think it's really, really important that we understand this. One of the mistakes that I see, especially younger producers using, is they're using a credit card, and they're not paying off that credit card in full every month, where so they're accumulating a very high amount of cost associated with that loan. Whereas if they were using an operating note or a line of credit, it would have a much lower interest rate, say, than the credit card. One of the other things here is that we do not want to use short-term loans as income replacement. So we're only putting expenses on these loans that we have a plan for repaying in the future. So it's really important that we do that pretty regularly, that we have a plan if we are going to be using these short-term loans. All right. So I do want to take a moment and talk about credit cards just for a second. Again, I think there are some personal finance people out there who, paint credit cards with one brush, and that's that they are bad. But if we are using a credit card responsibly and we are paying it in full every month, they can be a useful tool. Now, where people get kind of mixed up in credit cards is there really kind of two or three numbers right there. So you have your balance, which is the total amount of the money that a card holder owes the credit card company, and then you have the minimum payment. And what we see is that people are making that minimum payment thinking that that will negate that interest expense, and that's not the case. So we need to pay off that balance in full every month to avoid those higher interest rates, which can be upwards of 20% versus an operating note or a line of credit that's somewhere in the 8-9% range, depending on when you were engaged in that loan. Okay. So a couple of things about credit cards. Again, I want to emphasize that they are not all bad, especially when they are paid in full. They can be useful for short-term cash flow needs. But again, it's a very short window, less than 30 days. And if we are making purchases online, they provide far superior fraud protection for online purchases, more so than debit cards. So if you are doing a lot of online purchases, online payments, we prefer that you use a credit card because of that superior fraud protection. And I think lowest on the totem pole there is that they do offer rewards. But again, if you're not paying off that credit card in full every month, the rewards don't matter because the cost of borrowing money from a credit card is so high compared to other opportunities that are available to us in terms of short-term loan options. So I do have another caution for you as we discuss short-term loans, and that's that short-term business loans should not be used to purchase non-business assets, such as machinery. Excuse me, let me back up. Short-term business loans should not be used to purchase non-business assets. Okay, so if it's a business loan, we need to separate the farm from the family and make sure that we're not using that loan for non-business assets. The other thing is that these short-term loans generally should not be used for the purchase of intermediate or long-term assets, such as machinery, equipment, or livestock, or make payments on those loans, especially without discussing this with your lender first. So just because we have access to that financing, we need to be really thoughtful about how we're utilizing that financing. So again, don't use business loans for personal items, and also make sure that you're matching the style of loan with the item that's being purchased. So if it's a short-term input, it needs to be purchased with one of these short-term loans. If it's an intermediate or long-term purchase, it needs to be purchased with an intermediate or long-term loan. So we want to match those. So let's talk about intermediate and long-term loans here. These are items that are used to purchase intermediate or long-term assets, such as livestock, machinery, equipment, land, houses, etc. These typically have a lower APR than our short-term loans, and they're usually secured by the item being purchased, and there may be additional collateral that's required. Additionally, when we look at intermediate and long-term loan, they typically do not cover the total cost of the item that you're purchasing. So if you go to purchase a piece of land, usually we have to make a down payment so that there's a difference, and that difference is what we call owner's equity in the amount of the loan versus the value of the item that we're purchasing. This may also be accomplished if the item you're purchasing appraises for more than the value you're asking for on the loan. So I want to give you an example here of a long-term loan. And here's where I want to really emphasize that principal, that term, and that interest rate. So the principle here is that we have a mortgage, we're going to purchase a home. The value of that loan is $350,000. So that's the amount that we're borrowing from the bank. The term of that loan is 30 years, but we're going to pay that term monthly. So we're going to make 360 payments. And the cost of us doing this is 3%. So that APR, that interest rate is 3%. So we use that principal, term, and interest rate to calculate what our monthly payment would be. And it comes out to about $1,500 per month. Now, the total expense is much higher than that. So we have to repay the $350,000 for that home that we purchased, but we also have to pay back the interest that we used for that purchase, which in this case is just over $181,000. So the total expense of that home is over $500,000, even though we only borrowed $350,000. So interest expense is something that we do need to pay attention to, because over the life of that loan, we're going to be paying that back. Now, typically in these types of loan, as in these types of loans, as time passes, the amount of interest paid for each payment decreases and the amount of principal increases. So kind of have this graphed out here for you if you're a visual person. So basically that first month that I pay that mortgage, I'm paying $875 worth of interest, and only $600 of my payment is going towards the principal on that loan. Now, when I get to that final month of payment, the full payment goes towards the principal. And this is really important when we start to discuss, should I pay off debt? How do I pay off debt? And the earlier we are within a loan and we're able to make a principal payment, the more our debt will be reduced because we're paying off that principal earlier. And so there's less interest expense that we're having over time. So as you go through this process, remember that just because I'm making a $1,500 payment does not mean that all $1,500 here is going towards that principal. We're paying off the interest at a higher rate at the beginning of the loan than we are towards the end of the loan. Now, there might be some different structures. You might have a balloon payment or something like that towards the end that might adjust this, but a typical loan is structured in this manner. Okay. I think that earlier this week, Anastasia and Shannon did a really nice job of emphasizing the fact that we need to separate our family finances from our business finances. And I want to re-emphasize that point here today. It is extraordinarily important that you are able to determine the kind of family bucket of money versus the business bucket of money. So that means separate bank accounts, separate credit cards, making sure, again, we're not using business loans to purchase family items and so on and so forth. So if there's nothing else that you take away from today, please, please, please make sure that you are separating out the money from your business and your family. So where do we start to understand how much debt we have? And we start with most farm and ranches by looking at the balance sheet. And so if you have never seen a balance sheet before, again, I've got a QR code there on the screen. You are welcome to go watch that webinar goes through how to set up a balance sheet, what all you need to include on a balance sheet. But on a balance sheet on the right-hand side of the sheet, you can see that we're going to list all of our liabilities, and we're going to list them from current, which is our short-term debt, intermediate, and long-term down the balance sheet. When you are working on a balance sheet, you absolutely need to list all of your debt from every source. And one of the things that I see happening is folks will say, well, let's say it's a line of credit from a seed company, isn't with this bank, so I'm not going to include it on the balance sheet that I submit to that bank. That's not providing your lender with an accurate picture of the amount of debt that you currently have or the access to credit that you currently have. So we need to make sure that we're doing that. The other mistake that I see folks make as they go to make their balance sheet is on that intermediate and long-term debt, often there are payments that are due this year, and that needs to be carried up into that current portion of the balance sheet. So for example, if I have a mortgage, right, that mortgage is going to be listed down in that long-term debt category, but I'm going to have to make payments this year that I need to bring to the top of the balance sheet because I need to make sure that I can service that debt this year. Now, when you're working with your banker and you're looking at a balance sheet, often farm and ranch balance sheets provide separate spaces to list personal assets and personal liabilities. Work with your lender. Some people or some lenders like to see all of that information. Others like to keep it separate. If you do have significant personal assets or personal liabilities, it's likely that they're going to want to see that on your balance sheet and list that out, but work with your lender to see what they would like. Okay. So the next kind of idea here is, we've talked that not all debt is bad. So how do we define whether our debt is good or whether our debt is bad? And again, Other financial experts will come out and they kind of lump it all together. But I want to be very clear as we work with farmers and ranchers that there can be good debt. So what is good debt? Good debt has a relatively low interest rate. The item being purchased is expected to appreciate in value. The items you have purchased or the investments that you are making have long-term positive impacts or returns on investment. Often these items that we're purchasing have some sort of tax advantage associated with them. And then the last kind of bullet point is that the thing that is being purchased or the item that is being purchased is necessary. And I put necessary in quotes because it depends on the person who's buying the item, right? Might be necessary for me to have a first class ticket, right, on a plane rather than a coach seat. So again, that depends on the person. But do you view that item as necessary? Okay. On the bad debt side, it's basically the opposite. So we have a relatively high interest rate. Right now, that's about over 7%. The items being purchased have a shorter lifespan than it takes to pay off the debt. So the perfect example of this is I go to the grocery store, I purchase those groceries with a credit card. I do not pay that credit card off in full. And what happens there is by the time I actually pay off the debt for purchasing the groceries, those groceries are gone. So we have to think about the lifespan of that item. The other piece here is that that item is expected to depreciate. So again, this can be tricky, right? So the pickup that I need to purchase is likely going to depreciate over time, but it might be necessary for my business, or it might have positive impacts on my business. So again, there's some trade-offs here between appreciating and depreciating and whether or not it provides value to your business. The other piece here is if we have a loan and the value of the loan, the balance of the loan is greater than the value of the item. So I'm going to go back to that pickup example. If I have a pickup that's worth $40,000, but I have a $70,000 loan on that pickup, we call that being upside down in the pickup or in the loan because that loan balance is greater than what I could sell that asset for. Another piece that might tell us whether or not it's good or bad debt is if the item is necessary, which we've talked about. And then finally, on the bad debt side is there are situations and scenarios where you have too much good debt, right? We just have too much debt overall. And so we need to figure out a way to get that debt load down. So how much debt is too much debt? And this is really going to, again, we're going to separate the personal from the farm or the ranch business. So most financial experts on the personal side say that if your monthly debt to income ratio is greater than 20%, we have too much debt. Okay. Now, this can be difficult for farmers and ranchers because you don't have a steady monthly income. So, we may need to do some adjustments here to figure out whether or not we have too much personal debt. On the farm or the ranch side, there are two ratios that we look at. And again, if you're not familiar with the ratios, I encourage you to go back to that webinar on the balance sheets and listen to that webinar because we talk about different ratios that we look at your balance sheet for farm and ranch businesses. And the two I want to highlight today are your total debt to asset ratio. So again, we're going to look at that balance sheet and we're only going to look at the farm and we're going to say, is our total farm debt, what is the percentage of that relative to our total farm assets? So we want the total debt to asset ratio to be less than 60%. Okay. There's another ratio that we need to watch for, and that's the current ratio. And be careful here because we flipped the numerator and denominator here. This time we're going to put assets on the top and liabilities on the bottom. And what this asks is, do we have enough cash on hand to cover this year's debt? And so we want that current ratio to be greater than 1.3. So those are the two main ratios that we were looking at when we're trying to determine, do we have too much debt as a farmer or ranch? I have seen balance sheets for farmers and ranchers where their total debt to asset ratio is okay. They're less than 60%, but they don't have enough current assets to cover this year's debt. So again, we've got to have both of these to be secure and be able to cover our farm or our ranch debt this year. Okay, so how do we stay out of bad debt? I think Shannon did a nice job on Wednesday emphasizing this. The first thing and the most important thing that we can do for farm and ranch families is that we can have a emergency fund. Okay? So that emergency fund says, if income does not come in, will I be able to live? And so there's differing opinions from financial experts on how large that emergency fund should be. Some say $1,000. I don't personally think that that's enough for most farm and ranch families. I like to see 3 to 6 months of family living expenses in a liquid account, like a high yield savings account or a money market account, so that when the transmission goes out on the family vehicle, we have funds to pay for it. When maybe we have a difficult crop and we don't get as much money coming into the family, we're still able to purchase groceries, pay our mortgage, etc. The other thing for families is to budget for known upcoming expenses. Again, Shannon did a nice job about talking about this. You'll hear financial experts call this sinking funds, right? So we're going to plan for those big purchases that we know are coming up. So if we know that we need to replace the family vehicle, we're going to start saving for that. Birthdays, back to school, holidays, etc. We need to do that. And the other thing that we can do here is have kind of a plan or a waiting period for unnecessary items. Farther down on the list is know what can be financed and what cannot. One of the things that I think is difficult is, we kind of have as a family all of these long-term goals, right? Should I be saving to send my kids to college, or should I be saving for retirement? Well, your child going to college can obtain a loan to do that. There are ways to finance your retirement, but there's not like a retirement loan, right, that's out there. So we have to balance those. And then if you are already in bad debt, we don't want to take on more debt in that situation. On the farm or the ranch side, staying out of bad debt, we want to develop a realistic cash flow. And again, if you are drawing family living or owner withdrawals from that farm or ranch business, we need to include that so that our banker is aware of that. Again, we're going to list all of our debts on that balance sheet so that our banker can help us navigate that. We need to protect and maintain an acceptable current ratio, again, above 1.3, which means this year I hope to have $1.3 worth of current assets to cover every dollar of liabilities that I have that I need to pay this year. And finally, we need to have a strategic plan for large purchases, and we need to stress test those payments over various price amounts for the items that we're selling. So if I'm a grain producer, can I float that payment at $2 a bushel corn? Can I float that payment at $3 a bushel corn? And play with those numbers. Okay. So I'm going to take a deep breath here. We're about halfway through our webinar. Looks like we don't have any questions in the chat or the Q&A, but if you have those, feel free to stick those in. Happy to take those as we go along here. So you're sitting here now and you're going, okay, so what do I do? How do I know? So should you pay off your debt? And the question is, it depends, or the answer is, it depends. So what we have to think about is our cash flow. And as a farmer or ranch, or even as a family, we have to manage that cash flow. We want to make sure that we, can purchase what we need to purchase today. We also have, again, all these other goals that maybe we're working towards. And then we have this debt, and should we pay off that debt? So we have to decide where we're going to direct our money to. And the way I like to think about it is, if our cash flow is a river, we happen to be in this little canoe here. And the reason it's a canoe is because we have to balance, right? We can't tip too far one way or another. And we have to balance your present needs versus your future needs. Okay, so again, we've got to be able to pay our expenses as they come in today, but potentially also save or invest for those future goals. So as we think about this, if we're putting a large chunk of our funding on paying off debt, that might limit, right, the possibilities in the future. So we have to be really thoughtful about this. So this list is maybe a little bit different from some of the popular personal finance people. And it asks, where does paying off debt fit in the financial plan? So most financial experts say that the emergency fund is number one. Again, depending on how much you need there, some say $1,000. Again, I'm more in the camp of 3 to 6 months worth of an emergency fund. Okay. Some financial experts say you should not start investing until you have paid off that higher interest debt. And I would argue against that to some extent. So I put in what I call a 1.5. So if you have an off-farm job or someone in your family has an off-farm job and they have a retirement account that allows for an employer contribution, I actually recommend once you have that emergency fund built up, that you go ahead and try to invest as much as you can into that 401k or 403b up to the match. Okay. Because the return on investment of that retirement account is so good that you're losing money if you're not doing that. And the biggest key to long-term investing success is time. So if we're waiting to contribute to some of these longer term goals, like retirement, we're losing time, and that's the biggest key to success. So again, emergency fund, if you have a 401k or 403b with the employer match, that's kind of 1.5. And then we're going to start attacking that high interest rate or bad debt. Okay. So that's kind of where we're at. And then you can see as we go farther down, then in 3, we might start paying off that lower interest debt in there. And for farms and ranches, some of you might be sitting here saying, well, I don't ever plan on retiring. Why would I contribute to a retirement account? There are some tax advantages to retirement accounts, but also, maybe in 3, we would start saving for some other goals that you may have. Okay. So here are some questions to ask yourself to determine whether or not you want to pay off debt. So number 1, do you have that fully funded emergency fund on the personal side? And what is your current ratio on the business side? Okay. So again, we want to make sure that we have enough cash on hand so that our current expenses don't turn into debts, right? So I'm going to go back to that transmission issue, right? If the transmission goes out on a vehicle, I want to be able to have cash on hand to pay for that emergency situation rather than adding more debt, right, to that. So we want to make sure that we've got that buffer of cash that is available to us for those kinds of situations. Number 2 is, what are your goals? A lot of people want a debt-free lifestyle. If that's your goal, it's probably then, yes, we're going to be working towards paying off debt. But if you have different goals, again, if maybe we want to start saving to purchase land, so we're going to start putting money towards a down payment, or whatever that happens to be, your goals will adjust how you pay off debt. Number 3 is, what type of debt is it? Again, is it a good debt or a bad debt? Is it business debt or a personal debt? Number 4 is it a one-time payment? Is it a big lump sum, or are we able to make consistent payments on that debt? Number 5 is, how long will it take to pay off that debt? And number 6 is, what else would we do with that money? Kind of in terms of our cash flow. So if that money is going into a cash drawer, or if it's going into a traditional bank account, it's not earning us any money. And in fact, it's losing value because of inflation. The next step is those high yield savings accounts, money market accounts, or 1 to 5 year treasury bonds, which are currently earning about 4 to 5%. The next step higher than that would be index funds, ETFs, or mutual funds, which are currently earning in the long run between 8 and 10%. And then that highest level of return is the employer 401k with a match. And that depends on what match your employer is offering. Okay. So this is very important. And I'm going to reference back to this particular side. So this is the 6 questions for paying off debt. And again, you'll have access to these slides after today's webinar. They will be posted online on our website. There are a couple of methods for paying off debt. And again, these are probably more focused on the family side rather than the business side. The 2 common methods are the snowball method and the avalanche method. Both will pay off debt. I don't really think that there's much of a difference between the 2. The advantages of kind of that snowball method, which is the Dave Ramsey method, is that you get a quick win, right? So you list all of your debt from smallest to largest, and you pay off that smallest debt first so that you can then take that cash and roll it into your next payment. And what it does is it helps you get a win faster. The avalanche method actually helps you pay off all of your debt faster, and you will pay less in interest expense, but it can be difficult to stay motivated because it takes you potentially longer to pay off your first debt. Okay, so psychologically, most people prefer the snowball method because it gets you that quick win, but the avalanche method, from a mathematical standpoint, pays off all of your debt faster while paying less in interest expense. I don't think enough personal finance people talk about lump sum payments, and I think this is important for farmers and ranchers. Often when we have a good year or we sell something, right, we have this cash and we have to decide, what are we going to do with this cash? And so you have to decide which debt you're going to pay off first. And I do have some examples at the end, if we have time for it, that we can walk through. But if you're going to make a lump sum payment toward your debt, it depends on the interest rate of the various loans and the time remaining on the loan. So payments made earlier in the life of the loan will result in more interest savings over the long run. But of course, that depends on the interest rate. Okay. All right. This is kind of number 2, as we work through this, as the second big key takeaway is, if you are making extra payments, make sure that those extra payments go towards the principal. Especially if it's a car loan or a mortgage. Sometimes you have to jump through additional hoops to make additional principal payments, right? It does us no good to kind of prepay the next regular payment. What we want to do is make sure that that extra payment is truly going through to the principal, and we're knocking down that principal. Okay. Where do I find more cash to pay off debt? And nobody likes these answers, and that's because you've either got to increase your income or decrease your expenses. Again, I think the webinars earlier this week really dug deeper into some of those discussions, right? A couple of points that I want to emphasize here is, on the non-discretionary expense side, please make sure that you are maintaining an adequate amount of insurance. Here in Nebraska, we have some wild weather, especially on that property insurance. You know, we're seeing farms and ranches who are not adequately insured, and then a disaster occurs, whether it's a tractor fire or a windstorm that flips a pivot. That can not having insurance to cover those kinds of events can be detrimental to your financial position. So when you're looking at decreasing non-discretionary expenses and you're looking at your insurance, please shop around for your insurance, but make sure that you're comparing apples to apples in terms of the coverage that they're providing for that insurance. On the discretionary spending side, you may need to reduce your savings or investments to be able to handle paying down some of that debt. However, understand and know the long-term implications of doing that, right? So again, if we stop making retirement contributions today, we're losing that compound interest, right? We're losing time that we can never regain. So just be aware of that. Again, if your head is spinning right now, take a deep breath, and we will show you who you can work with. I have a kind of a next steps list here at the end of my presentation to help you find local help to determine whether or not you need to pay off debt and how to do that. So question number 6 on my 6-step question of paying off debt is, what do I do with the money that I have? And if I'm going to do something else with that money, often if I have excess cash, I can either pay off debt or I can save or invest. So when you get to question number 6, there are some decision statements here. So if the savings and investment options are earning more than the debt, we're going to save or invest. So again, I have some examples. I can show you that if we have time here at the end. If the saving and investment options are earning about the same as the debt, we're going to pay off the debt. And of course, if the savings and investment options are earning less than the debt, we're going to pay off that debt. So as you go through this process, if I'm personally comfortable with just having cash and putting that in my regular bank account, and I want to know whether I should put it in my regular bank account that's not earning anything or paying off debt, I'm absolutely going to go pay off debt. But if I'm interested in investing and truly investing, then I need to look at those loans and look at the relative interest rate of that loan versus the current returns on those investments. So here's my next step, okay? If you're overwhelmed right now, number 1 is to go through and to list out all of your debts. How much do you owe the neighbor? How much do you have on your credit card? How much do you owe on car loans or mortgages? Then I want you to go through that 6-question paying off debt slide and determine if you want to pay off that debt, okay? And only you can answer that. I cannot answer that for you. It depends on the type of debt you have. It depends on your goals for your future, and it depends on what your alternatives for that money is. And so it's a very personal decision to determine whether or not you need to pay off the debt. And then finally, I would really encourage you, if you already have a relationship with your ag lender, they can do some of these calculations for you. That's part of their job, is to help make sure that you can pay off your debt. So work with your banker or a local financial advisor to determine a plan that balances, again, that present you and that future you, to manage your finances and decide whether or not you have a strategy to pay off that debt. Okay. I do want to briefly go over some loan assistance options, and I want to put some cautions out here. Oftentimes people will come and say, I can help you, pay off that debt, and we're going to make it easier for you. And the first way that they do that is a credit card balance transfer, where you move the outstanding balance of one credit card to another. And supposedly this is supposed to simplify your payments by only having one monthly payment at a lower interest rate. Be very cautious with this. Number 1, typically in these types of offerings, there's a higher interest rate after the introductory period. They limit the amount that you can transfer from one credit card to another. And usually there are additional fees, such as a transfer fee. The other thing about doing this is, if you have not changed your purchasing behavior, this could be detrimental, right? You just basically just kind of kicked the can down the road with the credit card balance transfer if you continue to not pay off your credit cards in full every month. Next is a loan consolidation. It's a new loan used to pay off several existing loans or credit card balances. Again, kind of the same idea is to simplify the payments by only having one. But again, this can be challenging. You need to read the terms of that loan. So it might ask you to pay off that balance over a longer period of time. It might have higher interest rate, and again, might have additional fees. And again, if you haven't changed your behavior, it didn't really fix anything. It just put it all in one place. Next is refinancing, and this is something that we do or have done in agriculture. It was more popular when interest rates were lower, but this is a way for us to improve our cash flow and reduce our current liabilities by reducing or lowering our annual payments or renegotiating the terms of the loan. Again, basically what we're doing is extending the period of time over which the loan is repaid or reducing the interest rate amount. But currently, where we currently sit is that most interest rates are higher than the intermediate and long-term loans established in the last 5 years. So this can be very, very difficult. You need to run the numbers and see whether or not you can actually reduce your payment size because of where interest rates are at. The last one for farms and ranches is Chapter 12 bankruptcy. I want to point out that this is not loan forgiveness. It is a repayment plan. And to be able to qualify for farm bankruptcy, you must be engaged in farming. You must have total debts that do not exceed $11 million. And then at least 50% of the total debts are fixed, must arise from the farming operation. Okay. So with this, there is more information out there about Chapter 12 bankruptcy. It is an option if you are at that place, but I think the biggest point here is that it is not forgiveness. It must be repaid. So if you are looking at one of these loan assistance programs, I think it's very important to, again, look at not only what is the introductory interest rate that they are offering, but what is the future interest rate of that program. What are the additional fees associated with that beyond the interest rate? Again, there might be a rollover fee or something like that. And then what are they using as collateral to back that loan? So that is really important. And finally, have I changed my behavior so that I do not exacerbate the problem? Again, if we are trying to become debt-free, we need to work through that behavior to make sure that we don't continue to accumulate debt. And part of that might be, again, setting up that emergency fund, working on developing sinking funds, etc. So again, I don't want you to feel ashamed for your debt, but we just have to change how we manage that cash flow. So I'm going to pause here because I do see that there is a question in the Q&A. And I will, I'm going to stop the share just for a second to tackle that question. So the question was, can you speak more about the debt to asset ratio? 60% seems risky. What about continually leveraging assets for growth? So that 60% number is the high number. Okay. So of course we want to be less than 60%. And it really kind of depends on where you're at in the life cycle of your farm or your ranch business, right? So we assume that new and beginning producers, potentially, especially with that like first land purchase, are probably going to be at a higher percentage of debt. But we definitely want to be under that 60% amount. And it could be lower for you when you talk about the lower. If you feel like 60% is too risky, you could set a standard for yourself and for your business to be lower. So then the second part of that question is cash reserves to operate a business is much higher than personal living expenses. How do we earn interest if we're sitting on cash to operate the business. So we need to think about that. Hold on. We need to think about how we are managing our cash and what that really looks like and whether we are employing that cash. So when we look at the top portion of the balance sheet, that current portion, remember that that's not all necessarily just straight cash. That current portion of the balance sheet also includes grain in the bin, also includes investment in growing crops, also includes prepaid expenses. So it's kind of a misnomer to say that my current ratio of 1.3 or greater is fully just sitting in cash. We might have already purchased some of those inputs that are contributing to a current ratio of greater than 1.3. The other thing we could say is, let's say that current ratio is much higher than that. Again, what else could we do with that money? So again, it really depends on your situation, and we need to sit down with your bank to determine, let's say our current ratio is 2 or 3 to 1. Should we be maybe making some payments towards debt? Should we be investing that money differently? What should we be doing with that cash? And they'll help you with that. I don't see any other questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So I do want to share, I do have a couple of examples for you. We might go a little bit over time to adequately go through those examples, but I think it's fun, but I'm an economist. So again, I encourage you to hang on here as we go through some of these examples. But if you need to hop off, no problem. Okay. Shannon, did I get that reshared okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. So I want to show you the difference in paying off debt versus savings and investments in example number 1. And for some of us, we were lucky enough to lock in those low interest rates. So here's an example of that same mortgage we talked about earlier, where we had a $350,000 loan over 30 years and a 3% interest rate, right? So our option here, and the first thing we're going to look at is, let's say that I work through my budget and I realize that I have an extra $500 per month. What am I going to do with that extra $500? I could pay off my debt early, or I could invest that money. So here we go. You've got that original piece there on the left. So let's look at the scenario of paying off the debt early. So when I work to pay off the debt early, what happens is I'm able to take that 30-year loan and I'm actually able to pay it off in 19 and a half years. But again, I'm paying close to $2,000 per month. So I decreased my interest expense there at the very bottom by about $70,000. So that's one option. Now let's look at investing those funds. And again, we're looking at mutual funds, ETFs, something like that. And those are expected to return about 8% over the long run. Okay, so this is long run investing. I'm going to invest that for the same amount of time that it took me to pay off the debt early. So I'm not comparing this to my 30-year mortgage. I'm comparing it to the amount of time it took me to pay off my debt. So I'm only looking at 19 and a half years, but every month I'm going to take that $500. I'm going to invest it. And then we can see that the future value of that investment is estimated to be $281,000. Okay. Now, will I obtain that long run return from my investments of 8%? That's the unknown here. Okay. That's unknown. So that might be something that influences your decision here. But as we look at them side by side, okay, I've got the highlights that show you where kind of the numbers track from. But really, when we look at the bottom, investing in this scenario makes me better off. Okay, makes me better off. So in this example, because we have such a low interest rate loan, investing $500 per month would have a more positive outcome, assuming that we obtain the expected rate of return on that investment. So again, if we go back to our questions from before, what else would you do with that money? If savings and investments are earning more than the debt interest, we're going to save or invest. However, for some of us, there's a preference to reduce the known expense of the debt rather than the unknown rate of return on the investment. Okay. So again, that would be long-term investing. I think that's really important to understand is long-term 8% return is about average, but in certain years we'll get 10 or 12, and in other years it might be a lower percentage. But over the long run, S&P 500 is about 8% at a conservative estimate. All right, so let's run this scenario again, but let's run it with a higher interest rate loan on that mortgage. So this time we're going to run the same scenario and we're going to look at a 7% interest rate. So again, this is something that's really important here. And the payment here is higher. I had it incorrect on the last slide. I'm sorry about that. But the payment here is $23.28 because we have a higher interest rate. So again, we're paying significantly more in interest at a 7% interest rate on this loan than we were previously. So this time, it only takes us 18, give or take 18 years to pay off this loan. We're paying again closer to $2,800 per month, but we're significantly reducing the amount of interest paid because that interest rate is higher, okay? So as we come down to the bottom, by adding this additional $500 per month, we reduce the amount of interest paid by over $200,000. If we run the same scenario, here we're going to invest over 18.3 years at that expected rate of return of 8%. The overall investment value here is only $281. Okay. So what happens here is because of the difference in the interest rate, right? In this example, paying the additional $500 per month would have a more positive outcome than investing. So this is where it gets really important to not just do what your neighbor does, because you never know exactly what the terms of their loan are. So just to emphasize it again, the savings or investment options are earning about the same like they are in the scenario, a 7% interest rate versus an 8% rate of return. Mathematically, it makes more sense to pay off the debt. So just to reemphasize, the decision to pay off debt or invest depends on the interest rate of the loan and the expected rate of return on the investment. All right, so let's now move into a more kind of agriculture-based example. And here, what we're going to be looking at is that kind of lump sum payment against two interest rates, okay? So here we've got two equipment loans or two loans that are exactly the same except for the interest rate. And we happen to be paying off at the same point. So let's say we took on these loans last year, we have some extra income this year here in year two, and we want to go ahead and decide which loan we're going to put that lump sum payment to. So we've got $15,000 that we're going to make a lump sum payment. We want to know whether we're going to put it on loan A, which had a 5% interest rate, or loan B, which had a higher rate. So we worked through the math, and the 5% interest rate resulted only in about $4,000 worth of savings versus loan B, which had a 7% interest rate. And so that lump sum payment dropped us by $6,000. So again, as we kind of work through the math and we look towards the bottom, the loan with the higher interest rate is the one we're going to want to pay off here if we have two loans that are the same, okay? So you need to balance this because I'm going to show you this example again with a slightly different scenario, but we're looking at that interest rate when it comes to lump sum payments. So let's do this again. And this time we have two equipment loans that are exactly the same, except one began back in 2020. And the other began in 23. So they're both at 7% interest, right? But we're deciding, should we pay off the loan that's newer or the loan that's older? And mathematically, this is kind of a fun thing to do because on the first loan, what happens is because we're paying off in year two, we have a $6,000 savings rate. But on the second loan, if we pay it off in year 5, we only have a $2,000 savings. Okay. So when you look at this, if you have 2 loans where the interest rates are the same, paying the lump sum earlier in the loan will result in more interest savings. Now, I'm fully aware that it's very rare that you have, 2 loans that are exactly the same. Again, we can work through the math and see which one would be more advantageous for you to pay down on, and your banker would also be willing to help you with that as well. Okay, so again, the decision to pay a single extra lump sum payment would depend on the interest rate and the amount of time remaining on the loan. So with that, I know that I am a little bit over on time, but I will hang on if there are any additional questions here today.
Yeah, we'll give it just a minute. Okay. Well, I don't see any coming in, Jessica. Do you?
I do not. I just want to thank you all today and encourage you to dig into your numbers, and just know that we here at Nebraska Extension are happy to answer questions. My email address as well as my phone number are on the screen, and we're happy to work with you if you need maybe a second opinion.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us today during Egg Smart Money Week. You can find recordings of every webinar this week at cap.unl.edu/smartmoney. As you close out of Zoom, you will see a brief evaluation about today's webinar. We would really appreciate your feedback about this presentation and some ideas for future sessions. Have a great weekend.